On the afternoon of December 5th, 1945, the air at Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale was calm and cool, the kind of weather instructors loved. Visibility was excellent, winds gentle, no storms on the horizon, a perfect day for a routine training mission. At 2:10 p.m., Flight 19, 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, rolled onto the runway. 14 airmen made up the squadron, led by Lieutenant Charles Taylor, an experienced pilot familiar with the entire Florida coastline. This was a basic navigation exercise, one they had done countless times: fly east over the Atlantic, turn north, then return to base. Nothing about the mission suggested danger, no aircraft issues, no engine trouble, no warnings from weather stations. Flight 19 lifted off smoothly and vanished into the shimmering afternoon light above the Atlantic. For the first 40 minutes, everything was normal. The training tower received calm, routine communications. Then, just after 3 p.m., the first sign of trouble came through the radio. Quiet at first, then increasingly anxious. A student pilot's voice cracked through the static. "I don't know where we are. We must have got lost after the last turn." Controllers leaned forward. This wasn't typical. These missions followed extremely simple headings. Getting lost was rare. Minutes later, Lieutenant Taylor himself came on the radio. "My compass is out, both of them." The room fell silent. A single compass malfunction was uncommon. Two failing simultaneously was almost unheard of. Something was very wrong. As the minutes passed, the transmissions grew more unsettling. Pilots reported the ocean didn't look right. Islands appeared where none should be. Landmarks were unfamiliar. Even the sun seemed positioned strangely for the time of day. Ground control urged Taylor to fly west toward the Florida coast, where he would eventually hit land even with faulty instruments. Taylor hesitated. Then another pilot said, "We can't tell where west is. Everything looks wrong." Static swallowed the frequency for long stretches. When voices returned, they were panicked. Fuel was running low. Visibility was deteriorating. At 5:50 p.m., Taylor transmitted his final clear instruction. "All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch soon." It was the last coordinated message from Flight 19. Moments later, the radio crackled one final time. "It looks like we're entering white water." "Nothing seems right." Then silence. 5 aircraft, 14 men. Perfect weather. No distress flares. No wreckage. Flight 19 had disappeared. Not miles away, not deep in the unknown, but just off the coast of the United States, in an area every pilot knew by heart. The Bermuda Triangle mystery had just begun. When Flight 19's first confused messages reached the control tower, nobody panicked. Training missions often had small mistakes: new pilots, misreading bearings, brief instrument hiccups, minor navigation errors. But within minutes, it became clear this was different. Something was unraveling in the sky. At 3:15 p.m., controllers patched into the main frequency and heard scattered voices layered with heavy static. Multiple pilots were speaking at once, unusual for disciplined Navy aviators. One voice cut sharply through the noise. "We can't find west. Everything is wrong." The tower immediately tried to triangulate the squadron's location. Normally, they could pinpoint an aircraft's position from radio direction finding stations across Florida. But now, astonishingly, signals from Flight 19 bounced unpredictably, shifting between bearings as if the aircraft were jumping locations. The operators recalibrated their equipment. Same result. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Taylor's voice returned, strained. "We're not sure of our position. The sea looks strange." Pilots described waters that appeared lighter than normal, almost milky, a comment that startled older Navy men because similar descriptions appeared in earlier disappearances in the same region. Controllers urged Taylor to fly west. Even without instruments, flying straight into the setting sun would eventually bring him to Florida. But Taylor disagreed. He believed the squadron was somewhere over the Florida Keys, farther south than expected. If he was right, flying west could send them deeper into the Gulf of Mexico. If wrong, the opposite, straight into the open Atlantic with no fuel reserves. Then came one of the most unnerving transmissions of the day. We don't know how to get to Fort Lauderdale. These were trained naval aviators. They knew the coastline intimately. For them to collectively misidentify their surroundings defied logic. As 4 p.m. approached, radio contact weakened further. The transmissions now sounded disoriented, fatigued, and full of conflicting directions. Some pilots reported land in the distance, others insisted there was none. One said, "Everything looks wrong. It's like we're over a different ocean." At 4:25 p.m., controllers detected a faint signal suggesting the squadron had turned northeast, the worst possible direction, sending them farther into the vast Atlantic. Desperate, the Navy sent experienced operators onto multiple frequencies. Turn around, fly west now." But the pilots couldn't maintain formation. Fuel gauges were dropping rapidly. At 5:03 p.m., a brief, chilling transmission. "We're not certain of any direction. Even the ocean doesn't look like it should." Then static. Darkness began to fall. Even with perfect instruments, ditching at night in rough seas was nearly impossible. Flight 19 was now flying blind, without compasses, over an ocean turning black. At 6:04 p.m., a final broken message reached the tower. "If we just had land, but we can't make out anything." And then, "We may have to ditch." The signal faded. Flight 19 had flown into a region that swallowed both their instruments and their sense of direction. Whatever was happening out there, it was stripping trained pilots of the most basic ability they possessed, the ability to know where they were. The Navy realized something horrifying. They weren't just losing aircraft. They were losing them to something they couldn't understand. As Flight 19's final transmissions faded into static, the Navy moved with urgency bordering on panic. 5 aircraft missing was a crisis, but 14 airmen, nightfall approaching, and failing weather turned it into something much worse. At 7:27 p.m., the call went out for a Martin PBM Mariner, a massive twin-engine rescue aircraft known for its long range and ability to land on open water. The Mariner's crew of 13 responded immediately. They were experienced, confident, and equipped with flares, rafts, medical gear, and enough fuel to search through the night. Their mission was simple: reach the last estimated position of Flight 19 and locate survivors before the Atlantic swallowed them. The Mariner lifted off into the darkening sky, and only 20 minutes later something happened that stunned even hardened Navy men. A ship positioned along the Mariner's flight path reported a sudden, brilliant explosion in the sky. A fireball, a flash, then darkness. The ship's captain radioed, "A plane has just blown up. It disintegrated. We see burning fuel on the water." Within minutes, other vessels confirmed the same sight. A search boat reached the coordinates of the explosion. There were no survivors, no bodies, no intact wreckage. The Atlantic was on fire from floating fuel, but nothing else remained. The PBM Mariner had vanished as surely as Flight 19. The Navy immediately grounded the remaining Mariners, citing the model's reputation as a flying gas tank. These aircraft were known to leak fuel vapors that could ignite from a single spark. But the timing disturbed investigators. How does a rescue aircraft explode on the same night that 5 bombers vanish in perfect weather, in the same sector of the ocean, during the same mission? Some officers refused to believe it was coincidence. Meanwhile, back in the operations center, radio technicians attempted to re-establish contact with anyone from Flight 19. They swept emergency channels, long-range frequencies, even civilian bands. Nothing. The static never changed. It was as if the squadron had flown into a region where radio waves simply died. Search boats reported strange readings on their compasses. Aircraft returning to base described intermittent interference. Some pilots flying above the search zone said the ocean below looked unusually dark, as if lit from beneath by something shifting, moving. Rumors spread quickly. Mechanics whispered about electromagnetic anomalies. Operators speculated about magnetic deviations. Older sailors spoke quietly about earlier disappearances in the same waters. Ships, planes, crews, lost without explanation. By midnight, the Navy had 2 catastrophes on its hands, 5 bombers lost, 1 rescue aircraft destroyed, 27 men gone, 0 answers. The official search was expanded to over 200,000 square miles, an area larger than the country of Italy. But even with dozens of ships and aircraft sweeping the region, even with floodlights cutting through the night sky, the ocean gave nothing back. No floating life jackets, no metal fragments, no oil slicks from the Avengers, not a single trace. The disappearance of Flight 19 was already a mystery, but the loss of the Mariner changed everything. Whatever swallowed the first aircraft had taken the second one too. By sunrise on December 6th, the U.S. Navy had launched one of the largest sea and air search operations in American history. Aircraft from Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas swept across the Atlantic in expanding arcs. Destroyers churned through heavy swells. Submarines submerged to listen for debris impacts or metal echoes below. Even civilian vessels were contacted and rerouted to join the hunt. There was no way, no physical possibility, that 6 aircraft could disappear in a region so heavily monitored without leaving a trace. At least that's what everyone believed. For the first few hours, crews aboard search planes reported high confidence. Survivors might be floating in rafts. Wreckage should be easy to spot. The Avengers were designed to stay afloat for several minutes, even in a rough ditching. But as the day passed, unease crept in. Sea patterns were normal, visibility improving, no storm activity, no rogue waves, and still nothing. Not a single oil slick. Not a torn life vest, not a floating panel of aluminum, nothing the ocean usually spits out after a crash. Search pilots began voicing a disturbing observation. The ocean surface looked unusually calm, almost unnaturally smooth, as if the water had absorbed the impact without disturbance. One experienced pilot radioed, "It's like we're searching a lake, not the Atlantic." Meanwhile, Navy meteorologists reviewed all weather data from the region. Cloud cover was light, winds gentle. The primary weather threat, if any, was simply nightfall. Yet dozens of square miles showed no sign of Flight 19 passing through. As the search grid expanded, a new complication appeared. Compasses on several rescue aircraft behaved erratically, just as Flight 19 had reported. Some spun slowly, others drifted off course. One crew returned to base reporting, "Our heading changed by itself. The instruments aren't matching the horizon." These weren't rookie pilots. These were seasoned wartime veterans who knew the ocean better than their own backyards. The ocean gave them no help. Ships dragged grappling lines for miles, nothing caught. Aircraft flew low passes for hours, nothing sighted. Divers explored shallow drop-offs near the Bahamas, no wreckage found. The Navy doubled the search area, then tripled it, still nothing. By the afternoon of the second day, the operation commander issued a classified message. Probability of finding survivors diminishing rapidly, probability of locating wreckage, uncertain. But among the officers, a darker conversation had already begun. How can 5 aircraft ditching together not produce floating debris? How can a massive rescue plane explode and leave no identifiable remains? How can compasses malfunction across unrelated aircraft? How can ocean conditions remain so oddly uniform? Some officers whispered the unthinkable. They didn't just crash, something took them. It sounded absurd. It violated training, logic, and physics. Yet the facts forced the question. Because the Atlantic wasn't just hiding the answer, it was acting like it had swallowed it whole. While search ships carved endless paths across the Atlantic, The Navy turned its focus to the men who might offer answers, the instructors, mechanics, and ground crew who had prepared Flight 19 before takeoff. If the squadron vanished without distress calls or debris, investigators needed to know whether something had been wrong before those planes ever left the runway. The first interviews were routine: fuel checks, engine notes, maintenance logs. Everything appeared normal. All 5 Avengers were in good working order. No pilot reported instrument issues during pre-flight inspection, but the deeper the Navy dug, the more unsettling the testimony became. One instructor admitted that Lieutenant Taylor had arrived late and seemed unusually distracted. Not panicked, not unfit, just distant. Another mechanic noted Taylor twice rechecked his compass housing, something experienced pilots rarely did unless something felt off. Then came a detail investigators first dismissed, then reconsidered. A student pilot reportedly said before takeoff, "The compasses around here have been acting strange lately." Another ground crewman claimed that radio static had been heavier than normal earlier that day, even before Flight 19 departed. Were these coincidences? Background noise? Human error amplified by hindsight? Perhaps. But when investigators pulled earlier training logs, they found at least 3 instances from that autumn where pilots reported compass deviation in the same region. Not enough to halt training, just enough to raise eyebrows. Then the interviews shifted to the instructors who monitored the mission from the tower. What they described confused even seasoned officers. Several recalled Flight 19's radio signal drifting in strength and direction, almost as if the aircraft were moving erratically or the atmosphere itself was bending the transmission. Normally, triangulation would pinpoint an aircraft within minutes, but their bearings on Flight 19 never matched. Every reading contradicted the last. One controller said, "It felt like the planes were everywhere and nowhere at the same time." The most troubling statements came from radio technicians. They insisted the pilots' voices didn't sound like men flying into a storm or fighting their aircraft. They sounded like men who couldn't trust what they saw. One technician summarized it in a way that chilled investigators. They weren't afraid of crashing. They were afraid of being lost in a place that didn't make sense. When investigators sought navigational charts from the exact region the squadron believed it was over, they encountered yet another anomaly. Meteorological reports indicated no magnetic disturbances that day, nothing that should cause multiple compass failures. Yet 5 aircraft all suffered navigation issues at the same time, in the same place. The interviews ended with more contradictions than answers. No mechanical failure, no fuel contamination, no pilot negligence, no storms or rogue waves. But a pattern emerged, a subtle, hard-to-ignore thread connecting every witness statement. Something in that region made experienced pilots doubt the most fundamental navigation tools they relied on. Taylor's crew wasn't simply lost. They were lost in a way that defied their training, their senses, and the logic of flight itself. And for the first time, investigators began to consider that Flight 19 didn't just disappear. It might have crossed into a place the Navy couldn't chart. By the 3rd day of searching, the Navy's mission had quietly shifted from rescue to recovery, and then to something far more uncomfortable: containment. The scale of the disappearance, and the complete absence of physical evidence, was beginning to attract attention from journalists, civilian pilots, and even foreign intelligence observers. The Navy needed answers, but answers were not appearing. Dozens of ships now formed a giant grid across the Atlantic. Aircraft traced long, overlapping loops, their shadows stretching across the calm blue surface. Spotters scanned endlessly for anything: foam trails, life rafts, a wingtip, an oil sheen. Yet the ocean looked untouched, as if the 6 missing aircraft had never flown over it. Behind closed doors, high-ranking officers reviewed the growing stack of contradictory reports. Some pilots returning from search flights claimed their compasses lagged or twitched in the same sector where Flight 19 had vanished. Others described radio interference, bursts of static that erased entire transmissions. One pilot insisted his altimeter briefly froze mid-flight before correcting itself. He was ordered not to repeat that detail outside the debriefing room. Another search plane reported seeing a faint, diffuse glow beneath the surface, pale, colorless, gone in seconds. Sonar ships found nothing there afterward. None of these anomalies appeared in the official summaries. As pressure mounted, the Navy brought in navigators and meteorological experts to reconstruct Flight 19's most likely drift pattern, but every model collapsed. The squadron's last known heading didn't match their reported landmarks. Their described surroundings didn't align with any section of the coastline. Their believed location contradicted radar logs. The only thing consistent was inconsistency itself. One analyst noted, "They behaved like aircraft flying in a place that didn't correspond to real geography." To complicate matters further, civilian ships in nearby lanes began reporting strange occurrences, compasses swinging several degrees off course, patches of ocean appearing unusually smooth or reflective, and sudden changes in wind direction without accompanying weather shifts. Meanwhile, intelligence officers questioned whether Flight 19 might have strayed into restricted areas, Cold War experimental zones, naval test corridors, or radar fields not disclosed to the public. If so, the Navy would have strong incentive to keep those details buried. Yet even those theories failed to explain the core problem. Where were the aircraft? Wreckage sinks, yes, but not instantly. Even bombers filled with fuel and metal produce floating debris. Life jackets rise, rafts inflate, rubber, cork, and foam refuse to drown. But the ocean returned none of it. One commander wrote privately, "6 aircraft cannot vanish within sight of our coastline, not without something we do not yet understand." By the end of the day, the Navy began restricting information flow. Search logs were shortened, testimonies edited, certain radio transcripts were reclassified. The goal was no longer finding Flight 19. The goal was preventing the mystery from growing larger than the Navy could control. Because if the truth came out, that compasses malfunctioned across multiple aircraft, that instruments behaved unpredictably, and that the sea refused to return even a scrap of evidence, the public might ask questions the Navy wasn't prepared to answer. And so the mission entered a new phase. Not the search for aircraft, but the search for a narrative. As the search entered its second week, frustration hardened into something heavier: fear. Not fear of the ocean or the weather, but fear of what the investigation itself was revealing. None of the traditional explanations fit. Mechanical failure? 5 planes don't suffer simultaneous instrument collapse. Pilot error? 14 trained airmen don't all misread the exact same horizon. Fuel exhaustion? Even ditching at night would leave debris. Weather. The skies were clear, and so, behind locked doors, investigators began reviewing theories they were never meant to discuss publicly. 1. Compass variation and magnetic distortion. The Flight 19 region was known for abnormal magnetic readings. Maps from the 1930s recorded unpredictable deviations in specific sectors. Pilots in the 1940s filed reports of compasses swinging erratically. But never like this. Compasses failing across all 5 aircraft in the same moment. That wasn't normal magnetic interference. That was total navigational collapse. And the fact that search aircraft experienced smaller anomalies later suggested something larger was affecting the area. 2. Atmospheric refraction and mirage horizons. Meteorologists considered a rare visual phenomenon in which the Atlantic's warm and cold layers bend light, making pilots misinterpret distance and direction. But refraction doesn't make the ocean itself appear wrong, nor does it remove islands from view. It also doesn't explain why radio signals drifted unpredictably. 3. Equipment. Sabotage or technical fault. Could pre-flight errors have gone unnoticed? Unlikely. Maintenance crews checked the aircraft thoroughly. All engines, compasses, and radios were confirmed operational. Furthermore, sabotage wouldn't affect the rescue aircraft that exploded hours later. 4. Secret military testing, never officially acknowledged. Some investigators believe the region might have hosted classified radar or electromagnetic experiments, tests capable of interfering with aircraft instruments. If Flight 19 entered such a zone unknowingly, their equipment could have malfunctioned catastrophically. But when investigators requested documents related to classified testing, they were blocked. 5. Enemy action. The war had ended only months earlier. Some speculated a lost German U-boat or rogue submarine could have engaged the planes, but no sonar trace, no surfaced wreckage, and no intelligence intercepts supported this. 6. The geographic anomaly. Theory. This one appeared only in internal notes, handwritten, unconfirmed, quietly removed from the final summary. It suggested that Flight 19 may have entered a region where compass bearing, horizon line, and distance perception all distort simultaneously. A place where navigation becomes impossible. A place where aircraft lose their sense of position. A place where even radio signals behave unnaturally. No one dared call it supernatural, but everyone agreed on one term: a navigational trap. Some analysts believed such a trap existed between Florida and the Bahamas, a zone large enough to disorient pilots but small enough to avoid detection on most days. Flight 19 might have crossed directly into it. When the Mariner rescue plane approached the same area, it may have encountered the same anomaly, amplified by its fuel vapor issues, causing its fatal explosion. None of these theories appeared in the official report. Publicly, the Navy settled on a safer phrasing, cause unknown, possibly due to navigational error and weather deterioration. But every investigator understood the truth. The conditions that killed Flight 19 were neither ordinary nor easily explained. Something affected their instruments, something bent their radio signals, something hid their wreckage, and the Navy wasn't prepared to tell the world what that something might have been. When the Navy finally compiled its formal investigation, officers expected clarity, or at least a coherent narrative that made sense of the chaos. Instead, what emerged was a document so vague, so incomplete, and so contradictory that many investigators felt the report raised more questions than it answered. From the very beginning, the report was structured around one goal: eliminate anything that could not be proven through physical evidence. But since Flight 19 left no physical evidence, this rule had a strange effect. Nearly every unusual detail was dismissed. The compass failures across all 5 planes, not confirmed. The drifting radio signals, likely atmospheric. The conflicting bearings reported by the tower, possibly operator misunderstanding. The Mariner rescue plane exploding minutes after entering the same region, mechanical issue unrelated to Flight 19. In other words, everything strange was labeled coincidence. To those who had worked the search, this felt dishonest. One officer, speaking privately, said, "We wrote a report about a mystery while refusing to call it a mystery." The report concluded that the squadron was lost beyond recovery due to navigational confusion, deteriorating conditions, and fuel exhaustion. But nowhere did it explain why the conditions deteriorated, or why the compasses malfunctioned simultaneously, or why nothing from 6 aircraft ever surfaced. Even stranger, several sections of the investigation were quietly removed before the final publication. Missing were transcripts showing compass deviation across multiple aircraft testimony from search pilots about their own instrument failures, radar logs showing Flight 19's signal jumping notes on earlier missions that reported anomalies in the same region. When investigators asked why these details were omitted, they were told, "No conclusive evidence supports these claims." But the men who provided the testimony were furious. To them, the missing details weren't theories, they were events they witnessed with their own eyes. The most controversial moment came when the board attempted to assign blame. A portion of the panel argued Lieutenant Taylor made a critical navigational mistake. Others argued the squadron's collective behavior didn't match pilot error. The disagreement became so intense that the Navy quietly abandoned the effort to assign responsibility altogether. The final wording was carefully chosen. The Navy cannot determine what happened to Flight 19. No fault, no cause, no closure. For the families of the missing airmen, the report felt empty, a shell of an explanation designed more to protect the Navy's reputation than to reveal the truth. Behind the scenes, a few officers attempted to reopen the investigation, arguing that the case required deeper analysis, magnetic surveys, atmospheric modeling, and a broader review of electromagnetic interference in the region. Those requests were denied, the file was closed, and so the official account of one of America's greatest aviation mysteries became a single sentence: cause unknown. But those who participated in the search knew the truth was not simply unknown, it was uncomfortable. Because whatever happened to Flight 19 didn't behave like weather or human error or mechanical failure. It behaved like something the Navy wasn't prepared to name. Reconstructing the final minutes of Flight 19 was nearly impossible. There were no survivors, no wreckage, and no definitive radar track. All investigators had were fragments of radio transmissions, fuel calculations, and the desperate voices of pilots who understood their fate long before the Navy did. As daylight faded, Flight 19 drifted farther from any known landmark. The sun, which should have guided them home, seemed misplaced in the sky according to the pilot's descriptions. Taylor's last verified compass reading made no sense. The squadron was flying over an ocean they didn't recognize, an ocean Taylor described as white water, something veteran aviators had never heard him say before. By 5:30 p.m., the squadron's fuel reserves were reaching critical levels. The Avengers were rugged aircraft, but they couldn't remain airborne indefinitely. Pilots reported fuel readings dropping faster than expected, as if strong winds or unseen currents were dragging them off course. In the tower, radio operators tried everything: signal boosting, frequency shifts, emergency channels. They could hear Flight 19 occasionally, but the transmissions were fractured, distorted, and drenched in static. Then a chilling message broke through. "We can't tell where we are. Everything is wrong." Another pilot added, "We should have seen land by now." Something was deeply off. At approximately 6 p.m., the radio log recorded the squadron's closest thing to a coordinated update. "All planes close up tight. When the first one drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together." It was protocol. If one aircraft was forced to ditch, the others would descend in formation to increase survival chances. But ditching in the dark Atlantic was almost a death sentence. Minutes later, another weak transmission. "Still no land. We're heading northwest." Northwest. Every Navy navigator knew that heading would lead them deeper into the ocean, not toward Florida. Even more confusing, the bearings triangulated by towers suggested the planes were moving east, two contradictory headings at the same time. Then came the last coherent reported voice of Flight 19. "It looks like we're entering whitewater." Whitewater, an ocean that didn't look right, compass needles spinning, horizons shifting, radio waves bending, and then nothing. Silence swallowed the frequency. Search aircraft later reported seeing sudden fog banks, patches of strangely illuminated water, and cloud formations that didn't match the weather charts for that night. None of these details made it into the official report. By 7 p.m., Flight 19 was almost certainly out of fuel. The Avengers would have ditched one by one, skidding across the waves in total darkness. But such ditchings always leave a trace: fuel patches, debris, flotation gear. The Atlantic returned none of it. For investigators, the only logical reconstruction was this: the squadron became hopelessly disoriented, their instruments failed, they ditched somewhere far off course, but without wreckage, the reconstruction felt more like a guess than a conclusion. Because whatever happened in those last minutes wasn't consistent with any known navigation error, or weather phenomenon, or mechanical failure, it felt like the sky and sea themselves had shifted around Flight 19, trapping them in a place where direction, distance, and time no longer behaved as they should. And when the fuel finally ran out, the Atlantic didn't just take the planes, it erased them. When the Navy officially ended the search on December 10th, 1945, the Atlantic had given back nothing: no wreckage, no life rafts, no oil slick, not even a torn fragment of rubber or aluminum. 27 men and 6 aircraft had vanished without a trace. It was the only mass disappearance in U.S. naval aviation history where not a single physical object was ever recovered. For the families of the lost airmen, the Navy's conclusion, cause unknown, felt like a wound salted with uncertainty. How could such a large formation disappear only miles from the American coast? Why did the official report dismiss the strangest, most consistent details? Why were compass failures, distorted radio signals, and conflicting bearings treated as coincidences? Behind the scenes, internal documents revealed that the Navy feared public reaction. To admit that pilots could fly into a region where instruments fail and orientation collapses might imply that critical parts of the Atlantic were unsafe for navigation. And worse, it might suggest the Navy had no way to prevent future disappearances. For years afterward, whispers circulated among aviators and sailors. Some insisted the region between Florida, the Bahamas, and Bermuda had long produced unusual magnetic fluctuations. Others believed certain weather patterns, rare, unpredictable, could distort the horizon or mask wave conditions. But none of these explanations fully accounted for the total loss of Flight 19 and the Mariner rescue plane. In the 1950s, attempts were made to reopen the investigation, hoping better radar data and ocean charts might shed new light. Nothing changed. The Atlantic remained silent. In the 1960s, oceanographers mapped deeper sections of the Bermuda Triangle. They discovered trenches plunging thousands of meters down, zones so deep and so narrow that wreckage could easily fall in and vanish forever. But this didn't explain the compass failures or the pilots' descriptions of an ocean that didn't look right. In the 1970s, declassified communications revealed that several search aircraft experienced brief instrument interference in the same corridor where Flight 19 vanished. These details had been withheld from the original report. By the 1980s, Flight 19 had become legend, fueling documentaries, investigations, and theories, ranging from the scientific to the supernatural. Some researchers pointed to rogue waves, sudden optical illusions, or underwater currents that distort radar. Others believed the truth was simpler but stranger. Certain parts of the Earth behave unpredictably, places where magnetic lines bend, where atmosphere and ocean layers interact in ways we don't fully understand, where navigation, human or mechanical, becomes unreliable. Flight 19 may have flown into one of those places. Or perhaps, as one retired Navy officer wrote anonymously, they crossed a boundary we still cannot chart. Today, nearly 80 years later, the disappearance remains unsolved. The Avengers sleep somewhere beneath miles of water or somewhere far from where anyone expected. The Bermuda Triangle gave no answers, no closure, just a silence so complete that it feels deliberate. And so the mystery endures. Not because of paranormal legends, but because the truth remains just out of reach. Flight 19 didn't simply crash. It vanished.